本国是否跟随美国的做法，对中国制造的电动汽车增加关税，终于有定论。总理杜鲁多今早宣布，从10月1号开始，加拿大将会对中国制造的电动车征收100%的关税。本国汽车制造业界对渥太华的做法表示欢迎，但驾驶电动车的国民普遍对此不表赞同。
联邦政府针对中国制的电动车及钢铝产品定出新的关税以及开征日期，将于10月1号起向中国制电动车收取100%关税，并于10月15号起向中国进口钢铁和铝材开征关税25%。税率与美国看齐，适用于电动车以及某些双动能汽车、巴士和货车等。杜鲁多坦言，此举是反对中国不公平贸易行为。
What is important about this is we're doing it in alignment and in parallel with other economies around the world that recognize that this is a challenge that we are all facing, that unless we want to get in a race to the bottom, we have to stand up.
然而，大部分受访驾驶电动车的民众反对增加关税，认为联邦政府一边鼓励国民多使用绿色能源，一边为此设下藩篱，政策自相矛盾。
平时嘛，用特斯拉用多了，就是比较习惯用特斯拉，但是呢，就是可能因为价格原因，可能不得不去选择一些其他的油车。关税就导致可能可能不太会再去买电车了。但同时呢，这么多的电量让我们去要用这个电，可能就是比较矛盾的一个点。
So local ones should compete. Actually, I'm always for the merit, right? So they should compete with whatever the out of country also is available. They should make it better.
也有受访国民认为，联邦政府的决定蕴含各方面考量，包括中国制电动车安全性以及与美国的贸易关系。
然后加拿大你没有自己的汽车品牌的嘛，其实你主要是跟随美国的汽车企业来做这些事情的话，所以我觉得这个东西你如果不跟随它的这个政策的话，可能带来的麻烦会更多。
这是政府的决定吧，但是就要看怎么样，他们觉得更好的能够保护环境吧。保护如果让大家的这个消费更高的话，那么其实也是没有必要的。
加拿大全球汽车制造商协会欢迎渥太华的决定，认为公平透明原则对业界发展很重要。
The door is left wide open that these less expensive Chinese EVs would undermine the North American, Canadian auto industry, if you will, as we transition away from internal combustion engines to electrified propulsion.
Justin Trudeau and sellout Singh want to give taxpayer-funded subsidies for buying Chinese-made electric vehicles. And that is why common sense conservatives are calling for the introduction of a 100% tariff on made-in-China EVs entering Canada.
Hi, I'm Ismaila Alpha in Toronto, sitting in for Ian Hannamansing. This is Cross Country Checkup, the podcast.
Well, first of all, it's a bit of a joke that Poilievre is suddenly talking about workers in the auto industry. He has said repeatedly that he wouldn't have invested. He'd be cutting our investments in EVs.
Our question today, would you buy an affordable EV made in China?
It's one thing to lose market share in the dishwasher business, another thing to lose market share in the biggest industry in central Canada, in one of the biggest manufacturing industries in this country.
I'd jump at the chance to buy one. From what I've heard, they're really well-made vehicles.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't for a whole number of reasons. I would just look for one of the alternatives.
Now, you may have noticed that there's been a lot of hype around EVs made in China lately. Now, the reason for that? Well, the magic number, $13,000 Canadian. That's what it would cost for you to purchase a new BYD Seagull. That's a Chinese-made four-door EV with a range comparable to the most affordable electric vehicles you can buy in Canada right now. What's not comparable is the price. The cheapest 2025 EV available in Canada will cost you roughly $27,000 more than the BYD Seagull. As you can imagine, this could be a major problem for North American automakers. So American President Joe Biden announced a 100% tariff on EVs made in China back in May. Well, now the Canadian government is considering a tariff of their own. At the same time, they're trying to stay on track with their target of 100% zero-emission vehicle sales by 2035. Our question, Would you buy an affordable EV made in China? I'm Ismaila Alpha in Toronto, sitting in for Ian Hannah-Mansing. From CBC Radio, this is Checkup, the podcast, Cross-Country Checkup's live broadcast from August 18th, 2024. Now, before we get to the calls, your calls, of course, let's talk about how Chinese EV manufacturers got such a lead and what this all means for Canadian car manufacturing. Greg Layson is the mobile and digital editor at Automotive News Canada. He covers the auto industry, including electric vehicles, and he'll be with us for the remainder of the show. Hello, Greg.
Good afternoon.
So as of right now, electric vehicles made by Chinese manufacturers are not for sale in Canada, but that's not the case in other countries. How big of a player are Chinese companies in the electric vehicle market right now?
The biggest in the world, essentially. Sure, they're not here in North America yet, although they are in Mexico, so I suppose they are technically in North America. But they're the biggest player on the planet, and they're really trying to push their way into the biggest markets on the planet, and that is the American and, by proxy, Canadian electric vehicle market. And so they're pushed into Europe now. The Europeans have seen the problem with cheap or affordable Chinese electric vehicles. They've implemented a tariff. You mentioned it off the top. The United States is doing the same thing probably this fall, and we will likely follow suit. You mentioned the price, $13,000. That is incredibly enticing in countries and jurisdictions where they are going to be mandated as the vehicle of choice. The governments in California, BC, Quebec, Canada, they're eliminating the choice of buying an internal combustion engine versus an electric vehicle. And you mentioned it, electric vehicles are more money. So why wouldn't people buy a more affordable electric vehicle no matter where it's manufactured? And China sees that as an opportunity.
You mentioned again the price there because it's hard to forget that price. You made a very clear distinction there as well. And I want to note that you started to say cheap and switched over to affordable. How do these vehicles, how does the Seagull compare structurally and as a driving machine to vehicles we would see here?
There's a company well known in Detroit called CareSoft Global, and what they do is they actually tear down vehicles from a number of automakers to assess their quality, and they were able to get their hands on a Seagull, the vehicle we're talking about today, earlier this year and tore it apart. And that company I'm quoting now called it a clarion moment for domestic auto manufacturing in North America because the vehicle was so well put together, so efficient, and so good. It is a real threat to domestic automaking in North America because it was a quality vehicle. We often say cheap when we talk about stuff from China. This is truly a case of it being affordable and not cheap, i.e. junk.
Now, as we've been talking about, this is a lot less to buy this vehicle than any electric vehicle in Canada. The average price for an electric vehicle in Canada at the end of last year was $73,000, according to the Canadian Black Book. The Chinese company BYD sells a car called the Seagull, as we've been talking about, for $13,000. It's not the only vehicle that they make either. I mean, they make sedans and SUVs that all come in cheaper than $73,000. How is China able to produce these vehicles so much more affordably, more cheaply than we are able to do in Canada?
There's a lot of factors at play here. First, Chinese labor is cheap. They don't have the labor laws that we do. They don't have the protections that we do in the Western world. So labor is cheap. As an example, I had an executive tell me in about January, February, there was a strike at a Chinese factory where they were striking to get $8,000 annual salary, up from the $5,000 they were making at the time. So cheap labor. A lot of their electricity that powers those automotive plants come from coal-fired, coal-burning electric facilities. So power is cheap in China. And then you have on top of that, the Chinese government either outright owning some of these automakers and therefore funding them. And it doesn't matter if they lose money early on in their venture, or they're backed. If you look at the European Union tariffs, they went and calculated the three automakers that import into the EU. They calculated what percentage of the cost of manufacturing is subsidized by the Chinese government, and that became the tariff on that particular brand. upwards of 38%. So some of these vehicles, yes, they cost $13,000, but they'd be much more if they weren't getting money from the Chinese government. So those are the three major factors that keep Chinese vehicles cheaper and more affordable than most other automakers.
All right, I want to talk about tariffs a bit more in just a minute. For listeners and viewers, I am here live with Greg Layson. He's the mobile and digital editor at Automotive News Canada. Our question today, would you buy an affordable EV made in China? Call us at 1-888-416-8333 or go to cbc.ca/aircheck. Now, Greg, what would be the benefit for Canadian manufacturers if the government here decided to follow Joe Biden's lead on this and also place a 100% tariff on electric vehicles made in China?
So essentially, here's how this works. The United States implements a tariff to stop Chinese vehicles from entering the United States. That means any electric vehicles we build, and we will and do and are building them, now have market access to the United States without competition from China. So that's how that side of the coin works. The U.S. is now looking at us saying, hey, Canada, you also need to implement a tariff because we export EVs up to Canada as well. We need to be a good neighbor in this and work together. You know, one of the terms that's been thrown around is Fortress North America when it comes to the North American auto industry, and that includes Mexico. So the USMCA working as one for all of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So it's about protecting jobs here, because the fewer electric vehicles made in America means the fewer electric vehicles made in America means fewer jobs for Americans and Canadians. And about 80 to 90% of the vehicles, all vehicles we assemble in Canada, end up in the United States. And if there's starting to be an uptick of electric vehicle sales there, they'll want electric vehicles that are made in Canada shipped there. The tariffs protect that market on both sides of the border. That's the idea.
You bring Mexico into the conversation here, and I wonder then, and this is a hypothetical, but what if a company like BYD chose to try and manufacture in Mexico? How would that affect this whole situation?
So it's funny you mentioned that. So last month, BYD actually had their global debut of the Shark small compact pickup in Mexico City. They are selling those there now. They are selling Seagulls in Mexico. And the idea is gain enough market share to make it worthwhile to build a factory in that market. Now, if BYD has a factory in China and that factory can meet all the criteria within the USMCA, then they can ship those Chinese government-backed vehicles from Mexico to the United States and up to Canada, because it would fall under the content rules of the USMCA and qualify for duty-free shipment from Mexico into the United States and into Canada. And that is a play that China has been using. They've done this in other countries. In Malaysia, in Vietnam, for example, they build factories there and then export to countries that have a favorable free trade agreement elsewhere.
Okay, now, of course, that is a what if, not a big what if, but a what if nonetheless. Let's get back to our situation right now where, as we've been talking about, the Seagull is $13,000 Canadian. Now, what would that price be, that new sticker price, in Canada after a tariff were imposed, if it were this 100% tariff that the U.S. is doing?
Well, essentially double it. It'd be around $26,000. But here's the thing about these tariffs. Is China just going to up its government backing to each vehicle? I don't know if it works. I'm not that deep and well-knowledged into economics to know what China might do if they are slapped with a tariff that big. But even if that price were to double to $26,000 for a sticker price, you are still $14,000 below the cheapest EV available in Canada, roughly speaking. It is a major price gap between what China can offer and what we are currently building and offering in North America on both sides of the border.
Well, let's dig down a little further on the EV sector here in Canada for a moment. This is still a growing industry in Canada, according to experts, but that growth has really slowed. Why is that?
Well, look, automakers targeted affluent, well-off environmentalists early on when it came to the EV revolution. What automakers did is they electrified their luxury lines. So if you were Ford, you might be electrifying Lincoln, for example. If you look at General Motors, I use them as an example because if you remember that Super Bowl ad from about 3 years ago, the GMC Hummer with LeBron James, that was about a $100,000 $20,000 vehicle. It was all electric, but it was what only those well off could afford. And they were using the profits from that to try and develop something for the mass market. So, my editor, Jeff Melnichek, has a line that says, we're not out of early adopters. We are out of early adopters with money. There are still people out there who want to try an electric vehicle. They don't have the money to try an electric vehicle. And so if you've put all the early adopters in an electric vehicle at this point, they are, if they're leased, about 3 years away from another one. If they're owning, probably 10 years, 12 years, or 15 years away from owning their next one. The trick now is to get into the middle class and that mass market and sell something down the middle for everyone. And automakers on this side of the pond haven't been able to figure out that price point yet because the batteries are expensive. We're creating an entirely new supply line, which is also expensive. And so we're in this waiting game now where people want them, but they can't afford them.
You know our question that we're asking today, and you yourself are not just a journalist, you're also a consumer. So I pose it to you. Would you buy one of these vehicles?
Look, I'm going to buy whatever fits my family budget. Full disclosure, I just bought a new vehicle about 3 months ago, but it took me about 2 months to decide what I have. Look, a new vehicle is a line item in everyone's budget. Here's the thing. The government has essentially created an industry and created demand because they're saying by 2035, no more internal combustion engine vehicles, right? And so would I buy a Chinese vehicle? I think I would if it's all I could afford. It's always going to come back down to the pocketbook. And I don't think the politicians have looked far enough forward to go, I don't know when price parity arrives. This is going to be a difficult challenge. So right now they're trying to keep China at bay to allow the North American market to adjust. But if it comes down to it and I can't afford a domestic-made vehicle, I'm going to look elsewhere.
I ask you then, you stated that our government has created an industry here. Have they created the industry that Canada needs?
Well, to hear them saying it, it's the industry the world needs because their claim is electric vehicles are cleaner and greener and better for climate change and all of that. But, we've got to get these minerals out of the ground. We have to truck them. We have to process them. We haven't seen that in full capacity and in full function yet. We are so early in this. I always go back to, this is like the cell phone revolution, flat screen TVs. Flat screen TV, you probably walked into your friend's house 20 years ago and you had one and you thought, oh my goodness, how can you afford that? And now you can walk into anyone's house and they have one in every room and maybe on their patio and in their garage. So we're not at that point yet. That's what we're looking at here. Is it right for Canada? The government will tell you it's right for the environment. I think a lot of people will think that. I think there's a lot of questions. How long do they last? How do we get rid of the batteries at the end of life? There's just so much involved in this, and it's so complex. It's very hard to debate on a one question that you asked me there, or even over the next 90 minutes. It is that complex.
Greg, I'm glad to have you along for the ride on the next 90 minutes. Greg Layson is a mobile and digital editor at Automotive News Canada. He'll join us for the next 90 minutes, as mentioned, to answer your questions and add insight as we go along. We are taking Canada's Pulse live on Cross Country Checkup, and that means you can call right now at 1-888-416-8333 or go to cbc.ca/aircheck. Our question, would you buy an EV made in China, an affordable EV made in China? And coming up, we'll hear from a Canadian car manufacturer, advocate for Canadian car manufacturers, who will argue that Canada needs to tax Chinese-made EVs. That's coming up in just a few minutes, but we are getting answers to our question from listeners. We've received these on social media. Tarek from Sarnia, Ontario, reached us via AirCheck, and he said, yes, buying an affordable Chinese EV in Canada could be a smart choice. These vehicles are generally more budget-friendly, making electric transportation accessible to more people. With growing infrastructure for EVs, an affordable Chinese EV could be a practical solution for those looking to transition to electric vehicles without breaking the bank. Thanks for that comment. Amy Meng from Ontario reached us via AirCheck as well, and she said, no, I won't buy a Chinese EV. It is affordable but not safe. I don't trust the Chinese EV industry. The safety issue could also attack the insurance business. And Hugh Taylor from Vancouver reached us via AirCheck. He said, if you buy an expensive EV like Tesla that bills itself as American, a couple of minutes of research tells you that 50% of the Teslas in the world are made in China, the same country that makes all the critical parts for the rest of the vehicle. In fact, most cars now contain a big percentage of Chinese components. So thanks for chiming in and let us know your thoughts, your answers to the question. And Greg, I wonder what your thoughts are on that, the idea that most cars now contain a big percentage of Chinese components. How much of a factor is that when it comes to this whole race, essentially?
I mean, the big concern, I think it was Amy, her name was talking about safety. I would say security over safety is the concern here. You mentioned the parts. If you're getting a Chinese vehicle with all Chinese parts coming into Canada, let's not forget that Canada has banned Huawei, and Canada, in some governments, municipal, local, federal, whatever, has banned TikTok as well. There are reasons that governments have banned these entities from Canada. They are concerned about spying. They are concerned about data breaches. They are concerned about secrecy. And so, the line we use in the industry is that today's car is simply a rolling computer. And so imagine a vehicle equipped with not just one rear view camera, but LiDAR and radar and more cameras than one. These are all things collecting data and information that could be useful to a nefarious government entity from China. So that is a concern. And I was on a call about 2 weeks ago with some auto executives and some cybersecurity experts, and that is one of the biggest concerns in the industry is that what is in those cars and what are they doing when they're on North American soil? That is something we need to figure out before the industry and the governments let them into this country. That is a huge concern. You talked about Hugh saying, 50% of Chinese vehicle or electric vehicles coming from China. Just so your listeners know, 77% of Tesla Model Ys and 55% of their Model 3s claimed under the federal Incentives for Zero Emissions Vehicle program last year were built in China. 25% of those IZEV rebates were for cars built in China. A year before that, it was just 2%. So China is already a concern if tax dollars are a concern to you.
Well, let's get to some of our callers here. We've got Michael Vavrakovich on the line from Edmonton. Hello, Michael.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Great to have you here. So what are your thoughts on this? Would you buy an affordable Chinese-made electric vehicle?
I definitely would. I currently own a vintage Mitsubishi i-MiEV, and in terms of operating costs, it's really great. In the last couple of years, I've only bought tires and washer fluid for it, and I plug it into the block heater at work. So it's absolutely a no-brainer for me.
I wonder what goes through your mind then when you hear some of the concerns that people have around them, especially our government when it comes to human rights records in places that they're manufactured in China, and also the environmental concerns around the manufacturing in China. How do you square that away?
Right. Well, I think cobalt should be taken out of the supply chain. It doesn't feel necessary to me. But other than that, we all have our cell phones are all made in China in our pockets right now. And just blank there for a second.
Not a worry at all. Really great to get your thoughts on whether you would purchase an affordable Chinese-made electric vehicle, and the fact that you're already in an electric vehicle. Thanks for the call, Michael. Really appreciate that. We've also got Martin Handforth from Picton, Ontario on the line. Hello, Martin.
Hello.
So what are your thoughts here?
Well, I would not buy a vehicle for $13,000, given in this situation there's moral issues and legal liability and the security issues. And the expert that you have online already covered exactly what I wanted to say about security, the issues of electronics and the spying and the data surveillance software that's collecting data. That's really one of my main concerns. Why I wouldn't buy any vehicle just because it's cheap. But the next thing is the lithium-ion batteries. They are a reason why I would not buy an electric vehicle, no matter what. The concern about when they catch fire, that essentially it's a chemical fire. You can't put the fire out with water. And if an electric vehicle catches fire in an underground apartment, an underground garage, like the NAC, that'll be the end of the building. So the question is, what are the Chinese doing to get costs down on batteries? And there need to be very strict regulations about the mean time before failure with these batteries. But the last concern I have is the moral issues. It seems to me that worldwide that indigenous people end up having their land dug up for the minerals and being taken advantage of. And I think the Chinese tend to go to a greater extent in taking advantage of people. Anyway, there's moral issues around human rights with the Chinese, and that's just not worth buying a cheap vehicle to support the Chinese in these areas.
Well, Martin, I really appreciate your thoughts on this, and thanks so much for calling in. You too can call in and join this conversation. We're asking, would you purchase an affordable EV made in China? You can call us at 1-888-416-8333 or head over to cbc.ca/aircheck to get your thoughts in on this. Well, this isn't the first time North American car makers have faced a serious competitive threat in their home market. After gas shortages in the 70s, Japanese car makers like Toyota and Honda made serious inroads with small, affordable, and more fuel-efficient cars. And now, Canada's auto industry has concerns about the possibility of inexpensive Chinese EVs on the horizon. I'm now joined by Brian Kingston. He is the president and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, which represents Canadian auto manufacturers, including Ford and General Motors. We've reached him in Belleville, Ontario, pulled over in his EV as he makes the trip back from Windsor. Hello, Brian.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you here. So why do you think Canada should impose tariffs on Chinese-made EVs?
Well, the most important reason for doing this is because we have made huge progress in Canada over the past 4 years, winning job-creating investment into electrification. Over $40 billion has been committed by automakers in Canada to build battery plants, to retool facilities, to build electric vehicles. We are gaining a foothold in this emerging industry, and we're doing that in partnership with our American partners and allies. If we do not take action now to give these facilities time to come online, to allow manufacturers to build up their production capacity, we put all of that investment at risk. So that would be, frankly, an economic catastrophe. We can't allow it to happen. We have to support this industry and secure Canada's role in it first.
Now, when you listen to the concerns on the surface, I mean, it sounds like we need to find a way to prevent these very affordable and competitive vehicles from coming into our market. It sounds like blocking some competition. And there is an argument out there that if the Canadian market doesn't have that much competition, it won't be motivated to produce EVs that are more affordable to everyday Canadians. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that would be a reasonable argument if we actually had a fair playing field. North American manufacturers can compete with anyone and they can beat anyone, but they cannot compete with the Chinese if the playing field is not level. And right now, Chinese auto manufacturers are receiving well in excess of $250 billion in subsidies. By some estimates, the industrial supports to this industry in China are about 9 to 10 times what you see in advanced European countries and other OECD markets. So they have a massive head start and a leg up because the government has been deeply involved in this industry at levels that we've never even come close to in North America. So I don't think we have a level playing field. I think what you will see, though, with manufacturers competing in this space, we've gone from 3 EV models in Canada in 2012. There are well over 80 now in every vehicle size and segment. So over time, the competitive forces here will bring prices down, and you're already seeing price drops, but it won't happen overnight. And that is the challenge that we find right now.
You speak of evening the playing field there. And of course, you're speaking of evening the playing field from the manufacturer's perspective. Let's talk about evening the playing field for the consumer. How do we make a more affordable EV in North America available to consumers here?
So a lot has been done already to help attract some of these investments into Canada, into the United States, and bring facilities online. I was just visiting the battery plant in Windsor. That plant is going to have enough capacity to build 500,000 batteries for vehicles in North America. So what you'll see for the consumer is that as more of these models come online, as these plants come online, we're going to achieve economies of scale, and you will get to price parity with gas-powered vehicles. We've also seen governments at provincial and the federal level introduce purchase incentives. And the reason for that is to recognize the fact that this technology is more expensive, but a purchase incentive will help a consumer that wants to make the switch do so before we get to price parity. So there are some tools available to help Canadians afford these vehicles. And I think what you'll see over the next couple of years is more vehicles in some cheaper segments that are more price competitive. But it simply takes time. We're creating a whole new industry virtually overnight here in North America after well over 100 years of specializing in the gas-powered vehicles. So it will take time, but prices will eventually become equivalent to gas-powered vehicles.
You're mentioning there how fast we're trying to move at this point in time, and I want to talk a little bit about that development in just a moment. I am here with Brian Kingston. He is the president and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Today we're asking, would you buy an affordable EV made in China? Call us at 1-888-416-8333 or go to cbc.ca/aircheck. Now, Brian, I want to get into a little bit of how much we're having to speed up here and accelerate things in North America to catch up. I want to read you an email sent into CBC's Alberta at noon when they covered this topic. It reads, quote, North American auto manufacturers have had a lifetime to produce vehicles that would compete with anyone. They have chosen not to do that. Canadians deserve better. Bring on the Chinese autos. How do you respond to that consumer perspective, Brian?
Well, this transition has only started, and it's frankly still in its early days. If you look at what China was doing, back in 2015, they released the Made in China 2025 industrial strategy, and that's where they really started to focus on this technology. In North America and in Europe, there's been slower uptake on electrification until recently. So I don't think it's fair to say that they've had time to compete. This has really just started to happen. If you look at the past few years, we've seen about $1.2 trillion globally go into electric, and that's why all these facilities are starting to come online. But this is still very much a niche industry. The current Canadian vehicle fleet of all light-duty vehicles on the road, less than 3% are electric. We've seen sales increase. We're now over 10% of all vehicle sales are in the EV space, but this is early days, and we're just working through the early adopters. Now we're trying to move into the mass market, and frankly, while the price issue is a real challenge for a lot of Canadian households, to me, the bigger problem we have in front of us on this journey is charging infrastructure. And, I say this as I speak to you from my EV, that is being charged at a shockingly slow speed because the infrastructure that we have available is not very effective. So I think we've got other challenges that we need to focus on. The price piece will come together as these facilities come online.
I just want to jump back to something you mentioned a few moments ago. You brought up the battery manufacturing that is being brought here to North America, to Canada and Ontario, quite a bit of it here specifically. How much will those batteries cost in comparison to the batteries that are being manufactured in China, where I understand like most of the EV batteries are being produced there? So how much will the price difference be if there is one?
Yeah, the battery is absolutely the most expensive component in these new vehicles. The big question will be, what are the factors of production if you compare Canada to China? China obviously will have less clean electricity, coal-fired, diesel-fired electricity, and labor conditions that are not even comparable to what we have in Canada, where we have a unionized auto assembly workforce paying good wages with strong benefits. So these are inputs that make a difference in terms of the total cost of production. I think where the Canadian advantage will be, though, is on the fact that we have these critical minerals. This is something that does create a generational opportunity for Canada Canada, you can not only build an electric vehicle in this country at a Canadian assembly plant, but if we get our act together and approve mines in a reasonable fashion, you could have a scenario where every input into an advanced EV battery is sourced from Canada and built using clean electricity. There are very few countries in the world that have a grid as clean as ours. So yes, we are a higher cost jurisdiction because of some of those factors, but I think we're well positioned to be a leader in this space once we have all of those components of the supply chain come together.
Brian, great to have you as part of the conversation. I hope the charging doesn't take you too much longer. Thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Brian Kingston is the president and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. We reached him in Belleville, Ontario. Now, coming up, an environmental advocate makes the case for why we need low-cost EVs and soon, while protecting jobs here in Canada. The question is, well, how do we do it? We're going to find out in just a few minutes. In the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. Are you an auto worker, an EV owner, or car salesperson? Give us a call. Our question today, would you buy an affordable EV made in China? Call us at 1-888-416-8333. That number again is 1-888-416-8333. Now let's get to some of our callers here. We've got Barbara McClellan on the line from Colwood, BC. Hello, Barbara.
Hello.
So what are your thoughts on these EVs, affordable EVs made in China? Would you buy one?
I probably would not buy one because I already have an EV that I've had for 11 years, and we have two EVs. We have actually owned 3 EVs over the past 7 or so years. So I have no particular need to get another EV, but I do think that there is a role for imported EVs from China to play in stimulating competition and production in our North American market. I think the problem has been that legacy automakers have just not stepped up to the plate on this. One of your commentators said that this is early days. It may be early days, but we really need to be doubling down on the pace at which we're adopting EVs and making the changes we need to combat global heating. So I think that whether or not it's early days, we bought a Chevy Bolt in, I think it was 2017, can't remember exactly. Very good car, North American car. I thought it was great. It had 2 drawbacks. One is that even at fast chargers, it charged kind of slow, and it wasn't so great in the cold weather. But there was no reason why they could not have fixed those and really gone full bore on those, but they didn't. They dithered around, they stopped, they started, they did a different model. They didn't really seem to have their act together, and so I think a little competition from the Chinese might be a good thing.
Okay, so how do you think, in what fashion should this happen while we try to ramp up our own production here? Should there be a tariff at all on these Chinese vehicles, or should it be left wide open for them to be purchased for Canadians?
Well, I think a tariff is a reasonable thing. I don't know why the States has chosen 100%. That just seems like a kind of a knee-jerk thing. But I think one of the commentators was also saying that they look at the differential between the cost if it was built here and come up with a tariff that represents that difference. But I'm sure there's a way of doing it, and the other thing would be perhaps quotas and not sort of opening the floodgates and saying, okay, we're going to have thousands and thousands of these cars come in. I'm sure there's a way of doing it. Interestingly enough, I mean, you're probably not young enough or old enough to remember this, but someone mentioned when the Japanese started importing we started importing, I guess, from Japan cars. My husband and I bought a very early, cute little Toyota Corolla, 1972, I think. And it was a marvelous car. And, of course, there was doom and gloom, and people said they would fall apart and they weren't safe and this and that. They were great cars. And of course, Toyota has gone on to be a major car manufacturer. Right. And we have had those cars, I believe, made in North America. So there's no reason why that can't happen. But I do think we have to do it urgently. It's no good sitting around saying, oh, well, we have to wait for this and we have to wait for that. The legacy automakers have had time to get on the ball with this, and they really have not. And I think that
the competition will stimulate development of our manufacturing here.
Barbara, it's great to get your thoughts on this. Thanks for calling in.
Okie doke.
And that is Barbara McClellan in Colwood, BC. Morgan Whittle has called from Warren, Ontario. Hello, Warren. Hello, Peter.
How's it going?
Oh, I think I've got Morgan on the line right here, right?
Yeah, Morgan.
Okay, sorry about that, Morgan. Calling from Barrie, Ontario. What are your thoughts on this? Would you buy an affordable Chinese EV?
No, so I don't think I would. And you brought up the point before about if someone's doing this for climate change. There's different reasons, but if you're buying an EV for climate change reasons and buying it for cheap from China, where they don't follow the same regulations and in their manufacturing production, they don't really consider that as much as we do here in Canada. So you're almost not really getting what you're paying for when you're saying I'm doing this for climate change, but you're buying it from a place that really isn't considering how their process is affecting the climate in the long run. They're just doing it for the cheapest they can and to make the most money.
Great to get your thoughts on this, Morgan. Thanks for calling in.
Thank you.
Now we get to Peter Boyd, who is in Warren, Ontario. Hello, Peter.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm curious about Chinese EVs. Is this something that's on your mind?
All EVs in general. It's been on my mind for some time. Currently, I drive a hybrid, gas-electric hybrid. We get and it's a Toyota. It gets phenomenal gas mileage. We like it. It puts no strain on Ontario's electric grid. Ontario should have been working on providing a more sustainable electric grid. To build a nuclear plant, they're talking 10, 15 years. That's not going to be ready in time for 2035 when they expect all vehicles to be electric. Also, they want people to take their gas furnaces out of their house and put heat pumps in, electric heat pumps. We don't have the capacity to service all of the vehicles, all of the heat pumps that are needed. This is an issue that should have been taken care of years ago.
So it sounds like you feel that the focus is on the wrong place at the moment.
Yeah, and the other issue that I have is people live in high-rise apartment buildings. For my house, I checked into getting a charging station put in my house, and I was looking at about $5,000 to $6,000. Now, if in an apartment building, they have to dig up the parking lot infrastructure, they have to put in a bigger panel to service all the apartments, the landlord's not going to pay for that. The apartment dweller, I'm sure, is going to be on the hook for $10,000 to $20,000 and have to pay for that infrastructure. What happens if they decide to move out of their apartment? They can't take it with them.
You raise a number of very good questions there.
And I know that people have sat around and discussed this within the government, and a lot of people that are a lot smarter than me. Why aren't we hearing about these issues with electric vehicles? And yes, the shorter battery life in colder temperatures. I live in northern Ontario, so my battery life would be affected. I live 60 kilometers out of Sudbury. So, it's not feasible for me to own an electric vehicle, whether Chinese or whether North American. It's not feasible at the moment, and I can't see it being feasible by 2035. Now, I guess by 2035, I will be forced to buy a completely electric vehicle. I don't know why they didn't start out with supplying tax credits for hybrids and getting people to buy hybrids, because the hybrid that I'm driving is a van, and I actually work in the transportation industry, and I know that the mileage on my van is twice what the mileage on a caravan is.
Okay. Out of curiosity, what do you do in that industry?
I work in the taxi business.
Okay. Great to hear from you, Peter. You raise a number of great questions there. Thanks for calling in.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
You take care. We've got Ron Newton on the line from St. Catharines, Ontario. Hello, Ron.
Hello.
What are your thoughts here? Is a Chinese-made EV, an EV made in China, something that you would consider?
I certainly would. I think one point is I'm listening to your program. I didn't want to step on anybody else's toes, but I think the one point that hasn't been brought up, there's over 100 companies in China that are making electric vehicles. They are competing among themselves for the market. Not all of them are being subsidized by the Chinese government. They're going to have to survive on their own, creating a product that can sell. And like I said, I can't think of why we can't be, forcing North American industry to be more competitive now. They're doing the same thing in China, within the country to try and compete. And the other one item that hasn't been brought up, the cost of their batteries is the lowest in the world. They are creating a battery that's 50% cheaper than anybody else is producing, simply because they've eliminated a couple of the key components of the battery that is making them cost effective.
Great to get your thoughts, Ron. Let's check back in with Greg Layson, journalist with Automotive News Canada. Hello, Greg.
Hello.
What are you thinking about what you're hearing here so far?
Barbara and that last caller brought up the same point, essentially, is that why haven't North American automakers, the Detroit 3 essentially, gotten their act together and made cheaper vehicles? And I'm going to give you the answer in a word, and it's shareholders. If they don't make money on these EVs, shares go down, and that means less money for the company. That means job cuts. That means less product. You know how this story goes. There are layoffs. If the Chinese don't sell vehicles, the Chinese government just throws more money at those Chinese companies, and they continue to churn out vehicles to gain a foothold in the global auto market. That's what Brian Kingston is talking about when he says it's not a level playing field. If Ford or GM or Stellantis, all of those Chrysler brands, if they don't produce something profitable, they are dinged by shareholders. They are dinged by the stock market, and that trickles down to the everyday worker and the dealers. If China doesn't make money, it doesn't care, because it is out to cut everyone's prices, undercut them to gain that foothold. So shareholders are key as to why we haven't seen that here in North America.
Right. We've got some more comments here or responses from social media. Brian MacArthur from Cochrane, Alberta, reached us via AirCheck and writes, yes, I want Chinese EVs in Canada. Domestics have knowingly put themselves in this situation, all about profits. Well, time's up. The urgency to stop climate change is much more important than domestic auto manufacturers' profits at the expense of Canadians. China is doing lots to fight climate change. Tony Chu from Toronto reached us via AirCheck and writes, I, for one, will definitely not buy an affordable EV made in China because I will never support products made by countries that are a real threat to the global safety and peace. And Sean Marcel from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, writes, as for cheap Chinese vehicles, absolutely. I recently bought a Chinese CF Moto ATV because I got sick of my overpriced and poorly built American-made Polaris products. And what I found is the Chinese CF, for thousands less, has more standard features, is better built, and is way nicer to drive. As much as I dislike China, I like my money in my pocket a whole lot more. Please keep contacting us, letting us know your thoughts on this. We are asking, would you purchase an affordable EV made in China? Now, some environmental groups are raising the alarm about how a potential trade war with China over EVs could delay Canada meeting its climate goals. Rachel Doran is Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Clean Energy Canada, a climate and clean energy think tank at Simon Fraser University. We've reached her now in Ottawa. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on the show.
Great to have you here. So do you think Canada could still reach its 2035 EV target if we were to follow the U.S. and impose a 100% tariff on electric vehicles made in China?
Well, I think Bloomberg, among others, have been looking at this new tendency toward tariffs and said that is going to impact uptake. We can't get around it. Tariffs are taxes. And so, while driving an EV can save households money over time, in fact, we've calculated up to $3,000 a year, many people still need an affordable sticker price to think about purchasing one, even if they want to do so. So what the government does to respond to Chinese EVs is going to have an impact on affordability and potentially on uptake here in Canada.
So it sounds like you feel we wouldn't make that 2035 target. Like, how much of a difference would this make if there was a 100% tariff on EVs made in China? How long would it take us to reach 100% zero emissions vehicle sales here?
Well, maybe just to counter, because I think people hear a lot about, EV sales slowing. So for clarity, Canadian EV sales hit over 12% nationally last year and higher than 20% in places like Vancouver, Montreal, et cetera. So that's still kind of over a third increase from the year before. And a recent survey done by the Canadian Automobile Association said 97% of current Canadian EV owners said they'd buy another EV. So the demand is there. I'm not sure I can give you an accurate assessment around full impact, but I think what's interesting is different countries are approaching this in different ways. So I know there's been a lot of great points raised on your show about China, but just look at Europe, for example, and already the situation is in Europe, you can buy 11 different EV models for under $45,000 Canadian, whereas in Canada, there's only 2 models currently available. And Europe currently has double the sales that we do. So, I think it is interesting to look at their approach to tariffs, which has been a bit more flexible. Rather than slapping 100% on across the board, they've taken a bit more of a flexible approach, looking at some of the really important considerations your listeners have raised, like subsidization, trade practices, where companies are headquartered, and done an approach that's still more somewhere between around 18 and up to 48%. So again, I think there's kind of a sweet spot Canada might want to hit here, even if it's looking at how to appropriately respond to some of these concerns that might lessen the impact on household affordability. And pretty key, add in some other sweeteners that'll keep ensuring EV affordability.
Okay, we will check on those sweeteners in a moment, but what you're saying to me sounds like still put a tariff on these Chinese-made electric vehicles, not the size of the tariff that the U.S. has put on those vehicles. And I wonder whether you would have any concern about potential consequences from our largest trading partner, who is just to the south of us, if we don't match their tariff.
I think there's going to be geopolitical concerns. And as you noted, I work at a think tank focused on the energy transition. So I'm going to stay in my lane and not, go too far into geopolitics. But what I do know is, there's the possibility here for kind of a package of policies. So that something that can protect Canadian industry, because we have this really exciting emerging EV industry here in Canada, which has seen $50 billion of investments. And we've calculated we'll have 250,000 jobs, potentially up to 2030. But, those investments are really going to benefit from this ongoing interest in EVs and having, EVs built that Canadians can afford and that they want. So, I think by not only looking at potentially tariffs, if Canada deems that to be necessary, but also doubling down on charging investments, provinces can be helping with this. EV-ready building codes to address the concern one of your callers had around, whether people living in condo buildings are going to be able to have charging there. Something where we can extend the federal EV rebate and maybe even privilege, EVs rolling off supply chains in Canada. But today there aren't EVs rolling off supply chains in Canada except for the Chrysler Pacifica. So it really is important to note just how many potentially pieces of the supply chain are still today coming from China, and how, an approach that maybe isn't more nuanced might have unintended consequences.
So tell me now then about those sweeteners you were talking about. How do you sweeten the pot here while trying to slow or prevent competition from EVs made in China?
Well, for starters, the federal EV rebate isn't even right now set to exist until 2026, 2027, when Canadian EVs are going to really start rolling off assembly lines en masse. So that will be an important piece, just extending it. Provinces like Ontario that really anchor a lot of these jobs and industries we're talking about don't currently offer an EV rebate. So having something from the Ontario government to help support the purchase of EVs would be another great sweetener. And finally, by using an approach like France, who's kind of taken the approach to look at the emissions intensity of the vehicle and how much you get in a rebate. So Canada is super clean production. That's one of our great advantages and why our EV supply chain is going to be producing the cleanest batteries in the world. So if you're giving a bigger rebate for cleaner cars, that's going to be going to those cars built here in Canada and North America rather than the ones built in China.
Why are the incentives so important from your perspective, as opposed to another approach? Rather than making it cheaper by having an incentive that gives somebody money for purchasing one of these vehicles, why not allow more competition? Wouldn't that drive prices down?
I think you hit on it absolutely. There's a package of policies, and I know one listener alluded to this 2035 regulation that the federal government has put in terms of regulated sales targets. Maybe what's underappreciated about that is it's actually an affordability measure. If companies have to sell a certain percentage of electric vehicles each year, it's to their interest to be selling ones, or at least it has happened in other jurisdictions, where they're selling ones at different price points to ensure that people are going to want to purchase the electric vehicles that are rolling off their supply chains. And again, looking to jurisdictions like Europe, there are being produced profitably, these models at under the $45,000 mark. So, if there are Canadian consumers out there interested in that kind of EV, that might help ensure the availability of that across the country. But in addition to that charging infrastructure investments, in addition to helping make sure future buildings are EV ready, in addition to preparing the grid, these are all great things that both the federal government but also provincial governments can really lean into and help make sure the purchase of an EV is as smooth as it really can be for consumers looking to purchase one.
And I'll get you to pause just for a moment right there as we say goodbye now to our TV viewers on CBC News Network. As we continue today's live CBC Radio and CBC Gem, Rosemary Barton Live is next on CBC News Network. You are listening to Hour 2 of Cross Country Checkup live on CBC Radio. We have roughly 30 minutes left in our main topic. Coming up in our Ask Me Anything segment about Ukraine's invasion of Russia. It's a move that flipped the playbook on the war in Ukraine, and yet Russian soldiers continue to make advances in eastern Ukraine. You can start calling now with your AMA questions about the war in Ukraine. Our expert today can speak to the military ground game, to the political fallout on both sides. Call us at 1-888-416-8333 or cbc.ca/aircheck. Now, I am speaking right now with Rachel Doran. She is the Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Clean Energy Canada. Our question today, would you buy an affordable EV made in China? Rachel, China is the world's biggest emitter of carbon dioxide. Its annual emissions are double that of the U.S. If Canadians do want to buy an EV to reduce emissions, should they be supporting goods from a country with that environmental record?
Well, I think there's a few ways to answer this question. Maybe the first and to me most important one is just to maybe combat the idea that an electric vehicle built in China isn't going to be kind of helping the climate. Life cycle analysis is clear. Electric vehicles emit less over the course of their lifespan than an ICE vehicle, no matter where they're made. The majority of emissions that happen in the course of the ownership of the vehicle are how you fuel it. So a study that looks at the current production dominance of Chinese EVs says EVs will have 60 to 68% less emissions than a traditional gas-powered vehicle in the U.S., and that'll be even more here where we have such a clean grid in so many provinces. Maybe the second way to answer that question is, of course, as we've said, there is a premium on these kind of cleaner batteries, and that's what's so exciting about our production. And so as we do have more batteries produced in Canada, I do hope that consumers see the benefit of that and are really looking and placing a premium on how clean their production lines are, because that's where our competitive advantage is really going to lie. But finally, I would say China, has really been digging in the last 10 years to think about lowering its emissions and, is set and on track this year to decline for the first time since 2016. So that is huge to have one of the global emitters, like largest global emitters, peaking their emissions this year. So in many ways, that's due to all this technology that they have been investing in. And coming along with all these complicated questions about unfair subsidization. But in terms of emissions, maybe those are three just important things to keep in mind.
Thanks so much for being part of the conversation today, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate chatting.
Take care. Bye-bye. Rachel Doran is Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Clean Energy Canada. Coming up, low-cost EVs from China are causing political tensions in some corners of the country. We're going to speak with a National Observer columnist about how Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre are handling this political slalom course. In the meanwhile, we're taking Canada's pulse live on Cross Country Checkup. Give us a call. Our question: would you buy an affordable EV made in China? The number to call, 1-888-416-8333, or you can go to cbc.ca/aircheck. Let's get to some of these calls. We've got Brian Mollinson in Toronto, Ontario calling. Hello, Brian.
Hi, good afternoon.
So would you buy an EV made in China?
I would not. I buy Canadian-made vehicles, mainly because I want to support a key industry, and really the key industry in Ontario.
So then you're just willing to pay more for an electric vehicle, or is this something that you have to hold off on because you're not willing to buy a Chinese-made one?
I think it's a bit of both right now with mortgage rates. Yeah, I would probably put it off, and I would spend a bit more. I'm fortunate that I can. So I think that, if we do tariffs, it should be a targeted strategic tariff. It doesn't have to be 100%. It doesn't have to be permanent. But and Rachel made a lot of good points just now, in that we've spent a lot of money. We're investing, and I see it as kind of incubating an industry that is strategic for Canada, and it's really just good industrial policy. And I think we need to let that industry grow, and at some point those tariffs should probably come off. Or we come up with other options, like potentially enticing or a bit of carrot and stick to get them to manufacture here.
Great to hear from you, Brian. Thanks for calling. We've got Gordon Ward from Thunder Bay on the line right now. Hello, Gordon.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for having me on your network. My question is a warranty on these vehicles. Nobody has talked about it, and I just want, like the Chinese vehicles, that people buy one. If buy one, I just wonder if there's any warranty on it. If the batteries go dead, which is the main motor of the vehicle, are you covered for the cost of a new battery, or you have to come out of your own pocket? Now, I have battery-operated drills here, and you probably have some. You notice that one electric battery of one drill won't fit the other battery, and I'm just wondering about these batteries and these vehicles. They're not universal, not like the DC, AA, and AAA batteries, which you could put them in any instruments you want, and they all fit, even though they may by different companies. So has anybody ever looked into the fact about warranty on that? And if I have to cost me to buy the battery, it could cost me more than what the vehicle is worth.
This is something that I'm not experienced with. We've got Greg Layson with us, automotive news journalist. Greg, what do you know about that as far as the warranties and the universality of these EV batteries?
Okay, let's start with the warranty. Yes, automakers are going to warranty and guarantee their batteries just as they do any other engine parts or motor parts, tires, anything within the car. You look at a Kia 5-year bumper-to-bumper warranty would be a similar thing. But after that, yes, you're on the hook. So, those warranties would have drop-dead dates either by year or by mileage. So that's the first part. Now, the universal battery is a great point. There's a company in China, of course, that's what we're talking about, called NIO. And what they do is they actually have service centers that you pull into. You drop your dead battery out, and they put a new battery in, and you drive away. I actually have a friend in the auto industry, a former Bosch executive, who has experienced this and said it was one of the greatest things, one of the greatest ways to get around in an EV. So your battery is dying. You just simply drive in, pop the battery out, put a new one in while you go up on the lift, and away you go. And so he said it was comparable to filling up a tank of gas. That's where the industry has to get to really make people want to drive these vehicles. So I hope that helps answer the question of, one, the warranty. Yes, there's going to be one. It will be limited just like everything else. And then two, there is a Chinese company out there developing a way to simply change out the batteries. Does it go in every make and model? No, it just goes in their own. But it's a clever way to get over range anxiety and a clever way to get you on your way a little more quickly.
All right. What things should we be watching from China to model here? What should we be copying from what China is doing right now, government-wise and industry-wise?
Well, industry-wise, that battery swap by NIO is probably number one. And Stellantis, which owns all of the former Chrysler brands, so Chrysler, Dodge, Ram, and Jeep, they're actually working with them on that. That is number one industry standard-wise because everyone is looking to get back on the road more quickly and not run out of charge. The other thing is China is developing solid-state batteries. We talked about, you had a caller talk about fires, and part of the problem is the liquid electrolyte within the battery. If that becomes solid, fires are less probable, but they're denser. The batteries are denser and therefore last longer and charge faster. There's a company in China called Zeekr that can charge from 10% up to 80% in 10 minutes. Again, comparable to filling up your gas tank. That's what we're trying to get to. That's really what we're keeping our eye on in China is the battery development, more so than the vehicles themselves. I mean, vehicles, for the most part, this day and age are all pretty much the same, and that includes electric vehicles. There's not a lot of diversity or characteristics in vehicles these days, but it's the battery that we're really watching come out of China. In terms of government policy, what I'm watching is if we do implement tariffs in Canada and the United States, what are the retaliatory tariffs that China implements on products from Canada and the United States? Because we know it won't go unnoticed, it won't go unmatched. So if you're living in Alberta, are you worried about your canola crops? If you're living in Saskatchewan, are you worried about what happens to potash? And the list goes on of anything that we send to China could eventually be taxed as well.
Greg, I'm so glad that I have you here to take on some of these questions. Now, EVs made in China do present an interesting problem for Canadian politicians. Somehow, they need to protect Canada's car manufacturing, oil and gas industries, at the same time as meeting the insatiable demand for low-cost EVs and meeting the Liberal government's 2035 target for zero-emission car sales. Let's take a deeper dive into these political problems with Max Fawcett. He's the lead columnist with the National Observer. We reached him in Calgary. Hello, Max.
Hello, Ismaila.
So last week, Pierre Poilievre made his plea for tariffs on Chinese-made electric cars. I want to ask you about that, but first, let's back it up a little bit. What was Poilievre's position on EVs prior to that point where he made that announcement?
Well, I mean, his position was not particularly clear, as tends to be the case with someone who's not prime minister yet. But I think his goal, he certainly was not warm to the sort of broader idea of electric vehicles, but his concern is protecting jobs, protecting workers, and protecting industry. And so not surprising at all that he came out and endorsed, in some respects, front run, I think a decision that's going to come from the Liberal government any day now, which is matching the American tariffs on Chinese EVs, which is putting a new 100% tariff on them. And I think that makes a lot of sense politically, because the value of getting those Chinese EVs into the market will not be seen, I don't think, for years to come, and they will come. I mean, they are coming here, but we're not going to sort of benefit from them, and that's not going to start showing up in the politics for a while. But not protecting the jobs of auto workers here in Canada, that could be an election issue next year. And so I think we've learned from watching American politics over the last few years, watching Donald Trump win the Rust Belt in 2016, that you can't just kind of hand wave away the concerns of working people, especially auto workers, because they show up and they vote. And we have to sort of strike this balance between what is best for consumers, what is best for the climate, and what is best for our manufacturing sector, which is already under a lot of stress and strain from China and other parts of the world where they're doing things more cheaply. And it's a tough needle to thread for politicians.
You brought it up, and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland announced in July that the government is considering a tax on Chinese-made electric vehicles. The size of that, we'll still wait to find out exactly what it is from Canada. But what do you think the federal Liberals are weighing as they make this decision? Because I know you talked about the idea that the benefit from these vehicles making their way into our market wouldn't be seen as fast as the detriment that it would have to the auto industry here. So is that the same calculation that the Liberals are making here? Because you were speaking about Pierre Poilievre at the time.
Yeah, I think they are. It's tricky because they have so many balls in the air on this one. They have, what is best long-term for the country, what is best nearer term for their own political futures, and what commitments have we made already to our American partners. We are, and have been for a long time, sort of shared participants in this North American market, for better or worse, in terms of autos. And the Americans have made their decision. They have put these heavy tariffs on China. They are trying to protect their automakers from the threat of these, frankly, amazing vehicles coming out of China. And we kind of have to stay pretty close to our American friends or risk, being left out in the cold, not just on this, but perhaps on energy, on any number of other trade issues. And that only amplifies if Donald Trump gets elected in November. So, the Liberals are mindful of that. They're mindful of certainly the environmental goals that they have, and EVs are a big part of that. And mindful of they want to keep those ridings in Southern Ontario that are absolutely essential if they have any hope of getting reelected or even saving some of the furniture in the next election. So I think it's almost a guarantee that they will match the American tariffs. I think that is why Pierre Poilievre came out and sort of put that number out there next to his name. It's sort of one of those odd issues where you actually have a lot of alignment among political leaders in this country, whether it's Premier Doug Ford, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, or opposition leader Pierre Poilievre.
You had almost emphasized these amazing vehicles being made in China. I wonder, is this something you would consider, a Chinese-made, an EV made in China? Would you consider buying one?
I would be delighted to be able to buy one. I don't think I will be able to for a while yet, but it reminds me of that line from William Gibson's book back in 1984. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And, the future of electric vehicles is here. We just don't see it in Canada right now. We don't see it in North America because we are trying to buy time for our automakers to catch up. And look, no question, the Chinese automakers have advantages that simply aren't available to private sector companies in Canada. They use labor and have practices that we just wouldn't allow here in Canada. And so, I think there has to be a way of accounting for that, whether it's, you get smaller EV credits when you buy an EV that's made in China, and you get bigger ones if they're made in North America. Like, there's a way of accounting for the different ways in which these cars are made. But purely from a technological perspective, I would be delighted to be able to buy one of these Chinese EVs, because everything I've seen and read about them, they look fantastic.
Before I let you go here, the federal government is already requiring 100% zero-emission car sales by 2035. The Liberals have been facing all kinds of opposition to their carbon tax policy. What can be learned about how to sell climate change policy to Canadians?
It's a lesson that I'm not sure they will be able to apply in a way that will save them from decisions they've already made. But there's all sorts of lessons here for other parties, other countries about climate policy. And it's make sure that the consumer can connect the dots on the costs they're paying versus the benefits they're getting. And I think that has been one of the big problems with the carbon tax is, they've certainly, there's a rebate. They've tried to talk about it. It seems like still half the country doesn't quite know what it is or where it comes from. But there just is this disconnect between the climate policy that the Liberals have chosen to emphasize and the benefits that people are going to see in their day-to-day lives. And, if those benefits only manifest in, better climate outcomes 30 years in the future, that's a tough sell. I mean, that's a sell that you can make to a small group of people. But most people are more oriented towards their day-to-day existence. And so I think if they could go back and do it over again, they would emphasize things like making electric vehicles more accessible, cheaper, bigger subsidies. Yet, yes, those are not efficient ways to reduce emissions. Economists hate EV subsidies. They hate them. But from a voter perspective, that's something you can connect with in your day-to-day life. You can look at the EV that's in your driveway and go, well, I'm paying a carbon tax, but I also got $5,000, $10,000 off of this really cool car that I love. So I can kind of make it work. And I think that's the lesson going forward, is that the benefits have to be tangible if people are going to stick with the policy.
Max, great to speak with you today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
Max Fawcett is the lead columnist with the National Observer. Coming up, it's our AMA about Ukraine's invasion into Russia, the first foreign invasion on Russian soil since World War II. Our expert will answer your questions about what it means and what the retaliation could look like. You can call us with your AMA questions right now at 1-888-416-8333 or go to cbc.ca/aircheck. But right now we are asking, would you buy an EV, an affordable EV made in China? We've got Omi Pius on the line from Toronto, Ontario. Hello, Omi.
Hey, hello. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you doing? Would you get one of these affordable EVs from China?
I would. I currently drive a Tesla myself right now, so I'm already in the EV market. And if there was something more affordable, it would definitely be something that would interest me. But the only drawback I would say is just to consider sort of a broader economic implication. You know, if Canada were to experience significant imports of Chinese EVs, it could impact the domestic and North American auto industries, right? Influx of low-cost EV might put pressure on Canadian manufacturers and suppliers and potentially could lead to job losses and shift in the industry landscape. But overall, when we look at the economy we're in right now and just any opportunity to save costs and save money, also looking at the impact on the environment, I think it's a good investment.
All right. Great to hear from you, Omi. Thanks for the call. We've got a number of comments on social media as well. Barry Shell from Vancouver reached us via AirCheck and writes, I have a Tesla. As well, I have a relatively cheap solar panel system on the roof of the garage. This whole system means it costs nothing to drive. I drive in the sunshine. Canada needs to promote solar panels the same as China. Grace Martins reached us via text, and she writes, perhaps it's a short-sighted view, but as a young adult in Canada, I would buy an EV from China. I believe that EVs will be super beneficial and more sustainable in the future, but a lot of people my age can't even dream of affording one. Given the option to get a high-quality, low-cost EV, I'd take it. I don't think I'd care where it was made. And Diana Bliss from Calgary reached us via AirCheck and writes, no one has mentioned alternatives such as public transit. Why are we so fixated on having a private car? I gave up my car several years ago, and the only thing I find difficult is the fact that cities are built on the assumption that everyone drives and owns a car. Cities and people can function just fine without cars, and so far, no one is willing to say, let's build cities for people and not cars. Great points brought up there. Thanks so much. We've got James Chung on the line from Toronto. Hello, James.
How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm more curious into how you're doing. What are your thoughts on this, on our question today?
Yeah, a couple of things. So I would absolutely buy an EV from China. In fact, the Tesla Model Y, which one of my relatives own, is manufactured in China today, and it's a great car. It's a fantastic car. The other thought that I had that I don't think people are really focusing on is our energy transition policy effective, right? And I'm talking about, carbon policy, carbon tax, as well as tariffs. One thing that I've observed is that, we're importing today a ton of luxury vehicles, BMWs, Mercedes-Benzes, Audis, Range Rovers from Europe, and they're all gasoline and diesel. In fact, if you go into an Audi or if you go into a BMW store, most of the cars on the showroom, the luxury vehicles, are all gasoline or diesel cars. They're not EVs. And when somebody buys them, as soon as it enters the country and somebody buys them, that gasoline or diesel engine is going to stay around for the next 10, 20 years. You're going to buy it, you're going to sell it, somebody else is going to buy it, and it's going to continue working for at least 20 years. And I think that also brings another question is, even today, when you think about truck drivers, people driving their cars, we're being taxed on the carbon tax, and I mean, we bought these cars 5-10 years ago. I bought my Audi 5 years ago, and it's going to stay in the market for 10-15 years. What we should really be doing is looking at taxing or tariffing if we're serious about energy transition. Taxing or tariffing imported ICE vehicles to start, and maybe later on, once our domestic industries like our manufacturing plants, the Hondas and so forth, the Ford plants have transitioned to energy, then we need to start taxing gasoline and diesel vehicles manufactured in North America. But today we're seeing tens of thousands of cars, in fact, that are being imported, and this is not going to do anything. These cars are going to stay for the next 20 years in our economy.
Great to get your perspective on this, James. Thanks for the call. We also have Pat Burke on the line calling from Courtenay, BC. Hello, Pat.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. What are your thoughts on electric vehicles made in China?
Well, I have an electric vehicle that is made in Korea. I bought a Kia a year and a half ago, and I would never drive a gas car again. Never.
And so would you purchase one of these EVs, affordable EVs made in China?
Well, the situation here is that there is so much disinformation. If you go online and you mention EV, there is so much disinformation, even advertising information around EVs, and the batteries will catch on fire, and they can't go in the cold, and they can't do this, and it is so much disinformation that people are being scared away by this, and they don't realize just how inexpensive EVs are. Initially, yes, they are expensive if you want to buy a North American or Korean EV. But there is almost zero maintenance. There are no gas, oil, radiators. You don't have a transmission. You do not have a drive shaft. You do not have. You don't even need to use your brakes because it has regenerative braking. It's the amount that it costs to fill. People say to me, "Well, you have to sit for 40 minutes and wait for your car to charge." I go, "Yeah," and I get 400 kilometers from that, and you're sitting there for 10 minutes loading up a gas car where you pay $200 for it to fill your car. I do it for 12. Now, who wouldn't?
I can understand by your experience why you would be making that decision, given, though, that many people have different experiences and have different levels of ability to afford an electric vehicle. I wonder what your thoughts are around that. We're talking about a vehicle right now that, as I mentioned, would cost $13,000 Canadian to purchase, and even with 100% tariff, we're talking $26,000, still under $30,000.
And you know what? If that's going to rattle up the North American car industry and make them actually put electric vehicles on their sales lots and actually have them there so people can try them and start to build cars that aren't luxury cars. Like, not everybody wants a Tesla. Some people just want a little car that they can drive around that's not going to be expensive. Most people in Canada drive about 64 miles a day. I can charge my car overnight to 400 kilometers. Sorry, I meant kilometers if I said miles.
Of course, yes.
But that's what most people drive. It's absolutely the way to go. And I did like what your other person said, if you need to drive a car. If you're in an urban situation, you really should be looking at other types of transportation. I totally agree. I mean, we have to take care of the environment. That's got to be a priority. Anybody who says, the economy or anything else, that's craziness.
Oh, Pat, your situation sounds like a pretty good situation to be in when it comes to driving and living with an electric vehicle. Really appreciate the call, Pat. I want to get to another caller here. We've got David Ryder on the line. Hello, David.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. So what are your thoughts about this? Would you buy an electric vehicle there?
Yeah, I'm a reporter for the Toronto Star. So last year, I rented a car for 3 days to test a situation which is mine, which is I live kind of close to downtown Toronto. I don't have a driveway. I don't have anywhere to plug in.
Okay.
So I thought I'd like my next car to be an EV, but could that work? And I found it easily could. So one of your earlier guests said the issue for Canadians isn't really cost, it's the network for charging. I'd really challenge that. And that to me sounds like deflection to kind of help out the automakers. Because what I found is after 2 days, it was so easy, just at the Eaton Centre I would plug in, or there's the City of Toronto has some municipal chargers, and I would park for a few minutes before I went and got my groceries. I finally had to do a country drive to kind of give myself range anxiety to kind of like inject some drama into the story. And even then, because I was driving a Chevy Bolt, where when you brake, it adds kilometers back, I was driving down these hills in Caledon, and I was actually adding kilometers while I was going forward. So I just think for most people, for example, me, I bought my current gas car for $30,000. I don't want to spend more than that for an EV. So to me, if you're going to have tariffs, like maybe there has to be some incentive for traditional automakers to give people an affordable EV.
All right. Great to hear from you, David. Thanks for the call.
Thank you.
Now, we have had Greg Layson along for the whole conversation so far. Greg is the mobile and digital editor at Automotive News Canada. Greg, what are your last thoughts on this from what you've heard so far?
My last thoughts are this. Incentives are necessary. We've had incentives on many other things. Think of the home renovation tax credit, which you got an incentive to improve the your home situation and make it better for the environment and climate change. They are not forever. That doesn't exist anymore. Canada's incentives are too small, $5,000. Roughly the going rate around the world is 10,000 Canadian. I think that's something you will see as part of the platform in the next election. And I think that this is one of the most complex issues this industry has ever and will ever face. Just from a development standpoint where the technology is changing so quickly, there are so many layers to it. And Brian Kingston was correct in this point in that we have everything in this country to be a manufacturing powerhouse in electric vehicles. I've said it before, I've written a column on it where you've heard of from farm to plate. We are in the automotive industry from mine to driveway. We can mine everything we need. We can manufacture the supply chain. We can assemble the vehicles and we can sell them here and end up in your driveway. And that is the ultimate goal of the industry. It can be done. It won't be done by 2035. And I would gladly come back on the show in 11 years and say I was right. We won't hit that target. It's ambitious, but it's next to impossible.
Well, we look forward to that conversation, Greg, 11 years from now. Thanks again for joining me here.
Anytime.
That is Greg Layson, the mobile and digital editor at Automotive News Canada. You're listening to Cross Country Checkup. I'm Ismaila Alpha in for Ian Hannamansing.